No, I agree with that because so one of the things uh, that makes me think about this is because so when these kids end up in a workplace, uh, uh, they are not they are actually trained to address a problem, but the workplace does not does not give you the problem. You've got to comprehend the problem,
Yeah,
right? And
yeah,
suddenly when you have to comprehend the problem, they're asking a question saying, tell me what to do. Okay, while their bosses are actually telling them, go figure out the problem and solve it.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
and therefore I agree with you that whether you are a factory worker mode or whether you are a knowledge worker mode, the challenge today is comprehending the problem versus solve the problem or fix the problem. Okay, is actually the biggest problem that education is unable to solve, right? And therefore I would agree with you,
hmm,
and hence the fact that you talk about this whole big picture thinking, looking at
hmm,
metaphors,
yeah,
looking at thinking about one thing and doing it for 12 years. Okay,
yeah.
the framework. So can you talk to me about the framework and why that will ensure, or that will be a good, let me not use the word ensure, but that's a good starting point for kids in schools loving what they do, and therefore they start to learn and it sticks to their memory, right? That's what you
Yes,
talk about, right?
yes,
So
yes,
talk to me about that framework.
yes. Okay, so I think that I want to jump up right now and make a sort of meta point toward this, which is that I always find that when I talk about Egan's ideas to people, I end up having very different conversations if the people are one, if they're parents, whether they be homeschoolers or whether they're just parents who want to offer their kids new opportunities for learning. Very different conversation for how to apply Egan's ideas than if they are an actual teacher who is tasked with given with a specific thing or set of things to teach, and then how best to teach those.
Yeah.
And it's still very different from what the conversations that are appropriate to have with people who are designing um, new kinds of schools,
Hmm.
which is essentially what a position that homeschoolers are in because they can typically choose their own. Is homeschooling a thing in India?
It's catching up. It's a very, very small percentage. We are largely what I call as big label college education syndrome, right?
Sure.
So that's the that I would call as 98% of India
Sure.
is about, let me go to a big college, an IIT, a Stanford, a Cornell, then you're that shiny little thing. I'm actually successful, right?
Yeah.
So therefore, I think homeschooling is something that people are starting to appreciate, but I don't think there is so much of uh, I would say the take rates are far more lower, but everybody understands there is a problem of education, but
Yeah.
nobody knows how to solve it.
Yeah.
So I think in that context, the fact that they should enjoy schooling, right? And then they start learning versus understanding, right?
Hmm.
What you talk about. Okay, I can, education is one thing, learning is another thing,
Hmm.
understanding is another thing, right?
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think there is a struggle in India about this, and kids go through this problem, and therefore this concept that you talked about appealed to me, which is the reason I thought we should have this conversation.
Well, then maybe a good way for maybe a question that I should ask you is would you like me to answer this question as if I'm talking to a teacher or talking to a school founder?
So I would say I would take three, not two. So one is to a teacher, one is probably to a school founder, and three is to a parent.
Sure. Sure.
Okay, because I think parents also need to take cognizance of the fact that they have to prepare these kids for the world, right? And therefore just grades alone don't make kids successful, and they then suddenly realize this 25 years later, right?
Yeah.
So therefore the fact that these three things are so important. So talk to me about a teacher being a coach, okay, talk to me about school providing ecosystem for learning through understanding, and talk to me about how parents need to create an environment and not worry too much about uh, you know uh, uh, labels. But if the kid starts to understand, they'll figure out a way to succeed, right?
Sure.
So I think these are three important problems I think we are talking today, and I
Sure.
would like to
Sure.
address them specifically in these three tracks.
Sure. Sure. Happy to do it. Um, I would say that, then that with this, going back to your earlier, pardon me, with this, going back to your earlier question of what is this whole big picture? How does one tap into it to make learning meaningful, to
Mm,
make learning matter?
mm,
I would say that from the perspective of a teacher, the best that one has a curriculum that they are obligated to teach, the best that one can usually do is to say, is to start when one is thinking about every lesson, to start by saying, not what is the most important piece of this information for my students to understand academically, which might be the traditionalist approach. And it's not to say, what is the most practical element of this for that students can use? Both of these are not neither of these are terrible. um, but if you take this this understanding of human psychology seriously, that we need to make things matter,
mm,
we say, okay, if I have this lesson on, I don't know, the Pythagorean theorem, right?
mm,
Um, what about this matters emotionally
mm,
to me? Um, One of the things that we've been finding through the last 30, 40 now years of psychology is that we used to think that there was cognition and there was emotion. There was
mm,
thinking and there was feeling, and that these
mm,
things were relatively separate. And insofar as in that education is about the thinking parts, and that insofar as the emotion comes into learning, it's bad.
mm,
It gets in the way of
mm.
learning.
Correct.
So much educational psychology has been written that absolutely ignores emotions. I was told once in graduate school when I was bringing up some Egan ideas, they said, yes, 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 but that's motivation. That's
Mm.
separate. I'm like, no, that's never, ever, ever separate. You are fundamentally
Absolutely.
misconceiving of what learning is. What is wrong with this place? So then a teacher sits down when, I'll say this, like when I sit down and I think about a lesson, right?
Mm,
I say, okay, what is the most emotionally affecting aspect of this to me?
mm,
And how can I make that the center of the lesson?
mm,
How can I make that like something like a hook at the beginning?
mm,
How can how can I make that the payoff at the end of the lesson? What I do with, we haven't talked at all, but the company that I that I run, have we? So I should say at this point that at the beginning of the pandemic, I started a company called Science is Weird, with
yeah.
the explicit purpose of being a publicly accessible, a globally accessible instantiation example of Kieran Egan's vision of education. Because I
True.
saw that one of the biggest limits in people talking about Egan was that people didn't have uh, many examples that they could look at. And, I know that some people like us, like we can understand things through ideas, just through the intellectual work of a thing. But most people, like, and honestly, me, when I'm learning about something that's not about education, like I just need lots of examples of
Yeah.
the thing. And so what I've been doing with Egan education is coming up with so many examples of
Mm,
what Egan education looks like. Every lesson is designed to be a, carefully crafted um, uh, uh, instantiation example of what Egan can look like. So with those, I actually start with a riddle, and
mm,
then the ending is this revelation that upsets your view of reality.
mm,
That is, in fact, the exact opposite of something that you'd always assumed about the world,
mm,
but that and that you just never I guess that's the definition of an assumption, right? That you did not think that it would ever could be flipped around. So, sorry, I guess, what am I answering? I'm answering the question of what should a teacher do to bring the big picture in?
Yeah.
One should imagine that your students are meaning makers, that they have this view of the world, this emotionally charged view of the world. And you should find the aspect of your lesson that most is exciting, shocking, even for that. And then you should have the whole lesson be a way of sort of pulling out and exploring that one insight. Or at least that is a way of bringing Egan